Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf Beis. We begin the Masechta called Beitzah, which in the writings of the Rishonim is referred to as Masechas Yom Tov, because it is most of the halachos of Yom Tov. Therefore, it's very similar to Masechas Shabbos, in that a lot of those halachos are similar. We will introduce the particular laws of Yom Tov as we encounter each one. A lot of the Masechta also deals with the halachos of Muktzah, because Muktzah has a major aspect of Hilchos Yom Tov. Now, the Mishnah that opens the Masechta begins by listing three machloksim between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, in which Beis Hillel took the strict opinion and Beis Shammai took the lenient opinion. Two of these will be relevant to the halachos of Yom Tov, and they will very quickly get into the halachos of Muktzah. The Gemara is going to try to figure out what the explanation of the first machlok is. The Mishnah does not explain any of these machloksim. The Gemara will explain them all, but on the daf today, the Gemara will discuss the first one. We will see two complete explanations as to what the Gemara's machlokas, as to what the Mishnah's machlokas is about, with some discussion for each one. So first of all, let's see the Mishnah. The Mishnah lists three machloksim between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. The first is about an egg that was laid on Yom Tov. So the halacha about the egg that's laid on Yom Tov, according to Beis Shammai, you are allowed to eat it. It's mutter. There's no question of muktzah or anything else. Beis Hillel says it's aser. You're not allowed to eat it. Next, machlokas is about the minimum size of chametz and seor. That is, on Pesach, it's forbidden to eat or own chametz. That's a minimum size. Seor is sour dough. That is a very strong chametz. It's an extra chametz, which is used to make other doughs chametz. It's what we would use today as yeast. So the question is, what is the minimum size for these things? So Beis Shammai says that the minimum size of seor is a concise, and the minimum size of chametz is a koseves, which is larger than a concise. It is either a date or a fig. It's translated differently in different places. And Beis Hillel says that the minimum size of both is a kazayah. So Beis Hillel again takes a stricter shear. He has a smaller shear, and therefore more restrictive rules for chametz. And the third machlokes in the Mishnah is somebody who wants to shecht a wild animal, a chaya, or a bird on Yom Tov. The halacha is when you shecht a chaya or a bird, you have to cover the blood. You have to cover the blood with dirt. The question is, dirt is muktzah on Yom Tov. Shchita, slaughtering, is permitted, but dirt is muktzah. What could you do to cover the blood? So Beis Shammai says you're allowed to take a shovel, dig up some dirt, and cover the blood. Not a problem. Beis Hillel says you're not allowed to do that. At least you're not allowed to plan to do that. And therefore, if you don't have dirt ready, prepared, and ready to go, set aside, which is not muktzah, you can't shecht. Now, Beis Hillel does agree that if you did shecht, now you have to cover the blood. He does agree that you are allowed to take a shovel and dig up some dirt. Then he adds a final cryptic line, because the ash of a fire, the ash of a stove, is considered to be prepared. The Gemara will explain that later on in the Masechta. Okay, so the Gemara begins. The Gemara wants to understand the machlokes. The first machlokes is about an egg which was born on Yom Tov. What is the issue of an egg born on Yom Tov? So the Gemara jumps right into assuming that the issue is muktzah. Now, muktzah generally is defined, and it's time now for an introduction to muktzah. Muktzah is defined as something being set aside from use. That means you did not intend to use this object. It was not useful. That's what we call eino muchan, which is really the main category of muktzah. It might even be d'oraisa under certain circumstances. So it was not set aside for use. You mentally did not think of it as a useful, usable object. Now, if you did not think of it as a useful object when Shabbos or Yom Tov begins, it remains a muktzah or eino muchan object throughout the entire Shabbos or Yom Tov. So again, the criteria of something being not muktzah is that it has to be useful, and it has to have been useful from the beginning of Shabbos. It cannot become useful on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Now, as we shall see, there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon how far this extends. When do we consider something useful? When do we not consider the thing to be useful? But let's just begin here. The Gemara says that this egg obviously was laid from a chicken. a chicken has two potential states in which it could be. It could be viewed as useful, or it could be viewed as not useful. How so? If it's an egg-laying chicken, it's on an egg farm, so then you have no use for it. You're not going to do anything with it. You're not going to shecht it and eat it. It's meant to be alive and lay eggs. That's set aside from use. That's something which is ein muchan. That's muktzah when Yom Tov began. Now, because we're discussing Yom Tov. Now, if it is a eating chicken that's being raised for slaughter, so then it's food. On Yom Tov, you're allowed to slaughter it. You're allowed to eat it. Therefore, it's food even when Yom Tov began, and it's considered food. The Gemara's question, therefore, is as follows. If we're talking about a chicken that's being raised for slaughter, that means it's food. I could eat it on Yom Tov. So the egg that comes out of it is also food. It's like you cut off a slice of bread from a loaf of bread. You took food from food. So why should it be muktzah? Why would Beis Hillel say that it's muktzah? Why would there be any problem with this egg? The other way of looking at it, the other possibility is that we're talking about a chicken that was in an egg-laying farm. It's set aside from any use because it's just meant to lay eggs. If that's the case, then it's certainly muktzah. How could we say that it's not muktzah? It wasn't food. It did not have any function. The egg came out of it on Yom Tov. The egg began Yom Tov as part of the chicken with no function. So how could it be muktzah? How could it be mutter according to Beis Shammai? What would Beis Shammai possibly say is a reason to say that it is permitted? Now, the Gemara says we have to introduce here the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon as to how we define muktzah. Rabbi Yehuda takes a stricter approach, and he says that something is only defined as useful, as being prepared for use, if you mentally viewed it as being useful for the set use that you intend to use it for. I have a scroll and intend to read from it. It's a book that I plan to read from. That's its function. That's what it's useful. It's useful for that. It has its use before Yom Tov begins, and it retains its use. Anything less than that, Rabbi Yehuda says, is not considered useful, and therefore it's ein muchan and it's muktzah. Something which had a different use, and now you want to change its use, it was not set aside for this use, that's no good. Something which you didn't think of it as useful or not useful, you didn't think of it at all, you didn't set it apart, you didn't consider it as having a use. If I would have asked you, you're neutral about it. It was neither set apart from use, you did not mentally withdraw from it, and you did not have in mind of a specific use that it could be useful for. That's also muktzah according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now Rabbi Shimon takes a much more lenient approach, and he says it's only muktzah if you specifically mentally would have in mind not to use it. If it's something which is not useful, is set apart from being used, it cannot have any function. If it has a function, you can use it for a different function. It's not considered useless. It's not considered set apart from use. And if you didn't have any particular thoughts about it, if it would be something, again, this doesn't mean you actually specifically thought of each thing in your house. It means that had we asked you, you would have said that, I don't know, useful, not useful, I don't set it apart. I don't know if I'll have a use for it. I don't know either way. Rabbi Shimon would say all that is not muktzah. So the Gemara here, therefore, wants to say that this should depend on Rabbi Shimon or Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the Gemara's first approach is to say, maybe the Pshat in Beis Shammai is very simple. Beis Shammai does not hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Shimon, and therefore this egg was never set apart from use. You mentally thought about not using it. It was never set apart from use, and therefore there's no issue. And therefore it's not muktzah, and that's why Beis Shammai says it's mutter. And the Gemara rejects that. The Gemara says, how could you say that? The egg wasn't even born yet. It didn't exist. Something which doesn't exist, Rabbi Shimon should agree that it was not useful at the onset of Yom Tov. At the beginning of Yom Tov, it didn't have a function because it didn't have an existence. And therefore you mentally were not intending on using it because you didn't even know that it was going to be laid, or you didn't even plan for it to be laid. It didn't exist yet. So therefore the Gemara says we have a question, what is the case of this Mishnah, and why is the egg forbidden according to Beis Hillel and permitted according to Beis Shammai? What's the machlokas about? So the Gemara gives two approaches, each one with its own lengthy discussion. So the first approach is that of Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, actually, it is dependent on the machlokas Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. The machlokas Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is dependent on the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon holds that nolad, something which is not born yet, is not muktzah. And therefore, the machlokas is very simple. We're talking about a chicken which is set aside for laying eggs. Therefore, it's not food. It has no function. Now, this egg which is born, it could become food on Yom Tov. So, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's muktzah. It didn't have a function at the beginning of Yom Tov. It becomes a muktzah now on Yom Tov, and therefore it's aser. And that's what Beis Hillel holds. Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Yehuda. An egg which is born on Yom Tov cannot get a new function. It was set aside from use. It was not useful before Yom Tov. It was not useful at the beginning of Yom Tov, and therefore it's useless on Yom Tov. You cannot use it. It's muktzah. According to Reb Shimon, however, contrary to what we said earlier, even something which is not existing yet, an egg which is not born, which is what's called nolad, which is born on Yom Tov, is still considered to be not muktzah. Muktzah is only if something existed and you mentally thought, "Ooh, this thing is useless. I'm never going to use this." Like the chicken. The chicken was set aside for raising eggs, for laying eggs. It was not going to be eaten. It was mentally disengaged from. This egg, though, didn't exist, and therefore was not disengaged from, and it's not a problem. That's what Rav Nachman wants to say. And therefore it comes out again that Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Yehuda, and that Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Shimon. Beis Shammai takes a lenient approach like Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara says we have a problem on this, and that is that Rav Nachman elsewhere says the inverse. He says that Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Shimon, and Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Yehuda. What's the case there? So that's a case of muktzah on Shabbos, where somebody's eating a meal and he ends up with a pile of bones and shells on the table. Now, bones and shells are not human food anymore. They began Shabbos as human food. They were part of the meat or the eggs or the nuts that they were attached to, but now they're useless. Now they became animal food. So what is the halacha of these bones and shells? So we have a Mishnah that says that Beis Shammai says it's not muktzah. Pick them up, take them off the table, no problem. Beis Hillel says it is muktzah. You can only take them off the table if they're in a plate, and you're allowed to move the plate even though it has bones and shells on it. But you cannot touch them. They themselves are muktzah. And Rav Nachman goes ahead and he says that this explanation of these opinions is reversed. It has to be straightened out. And Beis Shammai is the one who has to say like Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore Beis Shammai is the one who says that it's aser. And Beis Hillel is the one who says like Reb Shimon. And Reb Shimon is the one who says that it's not muktzah. So you see that Beis Shammai, that Rav Nachman switches the opinions. And he wants to say that Beis Shammai is the one who holds like Rabbi Yehuda and Beis Hillel holds like Reb Shimon. How? And over here in our Mishnah could he say that Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Yehuda? So Gemara says the difference is that our Mishnah is talking about Hilchos Yom Tov, and your Mishnah that you brought is talking about Hilchos Shabbos. And Hilchos Yom Tov, Rav Nachman says that, as we said earlier, Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Yehuda. They take a strict approach. And Hilchos Shabbos, Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Shimon and takes a lenient approach. And I'm going to prove it to you, the Gemara says, because I'll show you two Mishnayos that have a stam Mishnah. They are listed without a name. Then we have a rule that's the halacha. The halacha is like the stam Mishnah. Now this stam Mishnah, one is in Hilchos Shabbos, one is in Hilchos Yom Tov. And in Hilchos Shabbos, it's going to go like Rabbi Shimon leniently, which means that the halacha in Hilchos Shabbos is like Rabbi Shimon. And in Hilchos Yom Tov, we're going to have a stam Mishnah that goes like Rabbi Yehuda strictly. And therefore the halacha on Hilchos Shabbos is like Rabbi Yehuda. That's why Rabbi Nachman said you have to establish that Beis Hillel, because the halacha in Machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is also always like Beis Hillel. Therefore you have to say that Beis Hillel and Hilchos Shabbos held like Rabbi Shimon leniently, in order that should line up with the Stam and Mishnah, that both Beis Hillel, the Stam Mishnah, and the halacha should all be one. And in Hilchos Yom Tov, the same thing, you have to line up you have to line up Beis Hillel with Rabbi Yehuda, taking the stricter approach, in order that Beis Hillel, the halacha, and the Stam Mishnah should all line up as well. Now, where do we see Mishnayos that are Stam Mishnayos that show me that halacha is like Rabbi Shimon on Shabbos and like Rabbi Yehuda on Yom Tov? So the Gemara brings it to Mishnayos. One says you're allowed to cut up a pumpkin to feed an animal, and you're allowed to cut up a nevela, that's a carcass, to feed the dogs. Now this is a carcass, even that the animal was alive in the beginning of Shabbos. This is talking about Shabbos, and it died on Shabbos. That would mean that it took on the use of dog food on Shabbos. So according to Rabbi Shimon, that would be mutter. Here you have a Mishnah that says that you're allowed to cut up the dogs. You're allowed to cut up the carcass to feed them to the dogs. It's not muktzah. So again, you see in Shabbos like Rabbi Shimon. And therefore we say that Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Shimon in Hilchos Shabbos. Now as far as Hilchos Yom Tov, we have a Mishnah that discusses wood. And it says you're not allowed to chop pieces of wood out of a pile of beams that's set aside for construction. And even if you have a beam that broke and fell out of a house, on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to chop it into firewood. Generally, you are allowed to chop firewood, but this is muktzah because it was part of a house and therefore not meant for firewood. The beginning of Yom Tov, it remains muktzah for the entire Yom Tov. So that is following the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon would say, no, it had a function before Yom Tov, it could have a function on Yom Tov. Even if the function changes, you could use it as firewood. So Gemara now asks, very nice, you've explained it very nicely. The problem is, why would Rebbe, who wrote the Mishnayos, why would he do that? Why would he paskin in Hilchos Shabbos like Rabbi Shimon leniently, and in Hilchos Yom Tov like Rabbi Yehuda strictly? Yom Tov usually has more lenient halachas than Shabbos. So Gemara says that's exactly the point. Because Yom Tov has lenient halachas, we were afraid people would be mizalzel, specifically in Hilchos Muktzah. They would make light of it, and they would violate those halachos easily without care. Therefore, we wanted to show strength of these halachos, and we went and we said we're going to paskin l'chumra, we're going to go strictly like Rabbi Yehuda in Hilchos Yom Tov. And that's the halacha. Yom Tov has stricter halachos of muktzah than Shabbos does. On Yom Tov we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, now the Gemara has a couple of questions on this approach. The Gemara says, so you're telling me that the case of the argument in our Mishnah is where you had an egg that was laid from an egg-laying chicken, a chicken designed to lay eggs, and the issue is that it's muktzah. So the Gemara says, well, if that's what you're talking about, why do you have to talk about an egg? You want to teach me the machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai is the same as machlokes of Yehuda and Reb Shimon. Talk about the chicken itself. You have a chicken designed to lay eggs, set aside for laying eggs, and on the middle of Yom Tov you decide, you know what? I want to use it for slaughter. I want to use it for slaughter. So in this case, it would also be a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara says, not like we assumed earlier. The chicken is a useful chicken. You had it around your house. You could decide on Yom Tov if you want to use it for a slaughter. You did not specifically mentally think of it as being for something else. So it should be the same machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, and that could be the machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. Why do we have to talk about the egg? So Gemara says we want to talk about the egg because the egg is a more extreme muktzah. The egg didn't even exist. It's more likely for you to say that mentally it has no use. You did not have any use in mind for it, and you would therefore think that Rabbi Shimon would agree that it's aser, and that therefore Beis Hillel would agree that it's aser, and therefore we want to talk about the case of an egg to show that even there it's mutter, according to Rabbi Shimon and Beis Hillel. So Gemara says, okay, that's very nice, but why don't you talk about the case of the chicken to show how far Rabbi Yehuda goes? Even the chicken which is not born, Rabbi Yehuda still says that it's aser. And maybe you want to tell me the Teira Adif, classic move the Gemara uses in cases like these. It's more interesting to tell you how far somebody whose matir goes, that has the strength of position to say that it's mutter, even in an extreme case. That's more interesting, that's more important to know than somebody who just says things are aser, aser, aser. It's always easy to say things are aser. You're not putting yourself out on a limb, you're just being cautious. So Gemara says, but if that's what you're doing, why don't you just say both cases? Say the chicken and the egg are both aser. The chicken and the egg are both this machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. You don't have to say one and not the other. Therefore, the Gemara wants to reject this approach. And it's Rabbah who rejects it, and Rabbah says, I'm going to tell you my own approach. Rabbah says, we're talking about a chicken, and now we begin our second completely new approach. The second approach to explain the machlokes in the Mishnah between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai as to what the halacha is of an egg that's born on Yom Tov. So Rabbah says we're referring to where the chicken was set aside for eating. It's food. The problem is like this. The problem is we're talking about Yom Tov, which came out on a Sunday. And any egg that's laid on Sunday was formed the day earlier. It had to be completely formed in the chicken's body on Shabbos. Now, That being the case, that means that the egg was prepared on Shabbos to be used on Yom Tov. We have halacha that anything which will be used on Shabbos or on Yom Tov has to be muchan. Like we said earlier, as far as muktzah, it has to be prepared and ready for use. Now, the halacha of muchan is that a weekday is suitable as the day on which you're going to prepare something for Shabbos or Yom Tov. Shabbos or Yom Tov requires the things that are going to be used on it to be ready and prepared for use beforehand. That means that on a weekday before Shabbos and Yom Tov, you have to prepare something that's going to be used. Now, the egg that's born on Yom Tov, which is on a Sunday, was not prepared on a weekday. It was prepared on Shabbos, which is a day earlier. You can't prepare to use something on Yom Tov on the Shabbos that's before it. It has to be prepared during the weekday, not during the Shabbos before. It has to be prepared before the Kodesh times. That's the halacha of prepared. It has to be set aside for use earlier. Therefore, this egg, which is born on Sunday, was laid on Sunday, was prepared on Shabbos, and therefore it's forbidden. And that's why you're not allowed to use it. So the Gemara asks, if that's true, so then what would be the situation if you had an egg that's born on a weekday which is not Sunday? Let's say you have an egg that's born on Monday. That was prepared for use on Sunday, which was a weekday. Shouldn't be a problem. But simple understanding of the Mishnah is that it is a problem even in that case. So the Gemara says, you're right, it's a problem in that case. If that's a gzeira, if we allow you to eat an egg that's born on Yom Tov, which is not on a Sunday, you'll end up eating it even if it is on a Sunday, and therefore we aser it no matter what day it's born. The Gemara says, okay, well, what about Shabbos? An egg which is born on Shabbos should be permitted because it was prepared on Friday. What's the problem there? How come that is generally assumed to be aser? The Gemara says there, it's aser gzeira on if Shabbos comes out the day after Yom Tov. Yom Tov comes out on a Friday. Therefore, that egg was prepared on Yom Tov the day before Shabbos, and therefore that's forbidden. So Gemara asks, do we make gzeiras like this? We forbid eggs in all situations whenever they're born, even if they're permitted because they were prepared on a weekday, because gzeira ought to cause you might have a situation in which you had a Shabbos and Yom Tov immediately following each other. The Gemara says, I'll show you that we don't make gzeiras like that, because the halacha is that if you slaughter a chicken on Yom Tov, if you open it up and you find complete fully formed eggs inside there, those eggs are permitted. Why don't we make the same gzeira? The Gemara wants to know. If you allow people to eat these eggs, they'll end up eating eggs which were born and actually laid on Yom Tov. Not that you shechted the chicken, opened it up, and found complete eggs in there. The Gemara says, you're right, we could make a gzeira like that, but we don't, because we have a general rule that things that are uncommon, we don't forbid out of gzeiras. The general rule across Shas. Shechting a chicken, opening it up, and finding a completely fully formed egg inside is rare, and therefore we're not going to make a gzeira like this.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.